Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening in Australia, where our speaker is from. I am Divine Indriga from the University of the Philippines Department of Linguistics. Welcome and thank you for joining us in this event today. This is the second installment of the Linguistics Special Lecture Series, or the LSLS, for this year. The LSLS features talks by invited experts on various topics under theoretical and applied linguistics and other related academic and social fields of inquiry. This is organized by the UP Department of Linguistics in celebration of its centenary, together with the Katig Collective. This is broadcasted live via the department's Facebook page and YouTube channel. If you would like to comment or ask questions, you may post them in the respective comment sections of these platforms, and they will be addressed later after the talk. So now we proceed to the lecture. Our speaker is Dr. Piers Kelly, a linguistic anthropologist at the University of New England in Australia. His research centers on creative extensions to ordinary language use, especially through writing and graphic codes. He has previously worked as a linguist with the National Commission on Indigenous People in the Philippines and as a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany. His book on the history of the Eskayan language and script is titled The Last Language on Earth: Linguistic Utopianism in the Philippines, published by Oxford in 2022. Here with us to present the Eskayan language of Bohol, the youngest and most ancient in the Philippines, let us welcome Dr. Kelly.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Hello. I hope you can all hear me. I'm just about to share my screen, and I will share the window. There we go. Good. Can you see my screen now? No. Oh, yeah. Okay, good. That looks good. Good. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you, Divine, and thank you to Christina, and in fact, thank you to all of the Katig Collective for having me virtually on campus to join the centennial celebrations for UP Linguistics. I'm coming to you from Australia, and I hope you can all make sense of my accent. I've spent a lot of time at the University of the Philippines over the years, and I've always found the Diliman campus to be a real haven from the surrounding chaos of the city. Those long lines of really beautiful acacia and fire trees feel very protective, and it puts me in mind of what a university should be. I feel strongly that universities should be institutions that serve the public good and that they are havens for students and researchers to explore ideas fearlessly, to try things out that might not work, to ask questions, to make mistakes, to be provocative, and to use all of that knowledge and experience to reduce the suffering in the world. And this is also in line with the philosophy of the Katig Collective. So I want to express solidarity with my Filipino colleagues currently dealing with red tagging and other anti-intellectual, anti-democratic, and anti-knowledge actions. I salute you all. I'm going to be giving you a gentle introduction to the Eskayan language and to my journey towards understanding its history. It's not going to be super heavy on linguistics or on theory. You can relax a bit. All the really hardcore analysis is buried within the pages of my recent book that Divine mentioned, which hopefully will be available to borrow from the university library quite soon. You can also get it, I think, from Solidaridad Bookshop. I'm also not going to talk a great deal about the script, unfortunately, but there's a that would be another 45 minutes, but there's a paper of mine that you can just Google and download at your leisure, and you can of course ask me questions about the script afterwards. I'll start with a few points of connection between linguistics at the University of the Philippines and the narrative I'm going to relate about my research today. So as you might know, your department from its very beginnings was instrumental in setting the terms of what would be called the national language question. Back in 1922, the Department of Oriental Languages, as it was then named, was called upon by the government to engage in a rigorous study of all Philippine languages in order to produce informed students who could develop language policy. So very forward-looking, very practical expectations, very applied linguistics. Into the 1930s, Filipino citizens were gearing up for eventual independence from the US. And there was this space to imagine a new kind of identity, a new kind of future for the Philippines. So some people said, let's make the national language English, given that it's already the language of government. It's a kind of a lingua franca. Others said it's got to be Tagalog. That's the language of the elites and it's Rizal's language. Another said, let's make it Visayan. There's more speakers than Tagalog. And there was even this idea of somehow fusing all the major languages of the Philippines and all the variants together to make some kind of super language. And this might sound a little bit wild, but this was not an elite discussion that took place only within the walls of the Department of Oriental Languages. This was something that ordinary people talked about and were emotionally invested in and had their own creative ideas about. Filipinos were generally of the view that language policy under the Spanish administration had not been in their interests, with the perception that the Spanish had deliberately excluded the general population from acquiring Spanish as the language of power and administration. And this exclusion even came to be seen as one of the grievances that spurred the Philippine Revolution. So you can understand that in the Commonwealth period, everyone really wanted a say in this. And at a certain point, the question needed to be decided with urgency. What will the national language be? So now we get up to 1937. President Manuel Quezon is leader of the Commonwealth, and he, or rather his secretary, Jorge Vargas, receives a letter from a man called Mariana de Tahon, who lives in a little village in Bohol called Biabas. This is where Biabas is, and that's where it looks like. That's what it looks like. It's on the front cover of my book. A tiny village, a few hundred people. And in this letter, de Tahon says to President Quezon, you've got to come and visit us because we don't speak Tagalog. We don't even speak Cebuano. Here we speak something else. We have our special script, and we even have an adult school dedicated to teaching and writing in our own language. And here's a homemade textbook in the language that I've enclosed for you. This letter to the president is now lost, and the only reason we know de Tahon sent it at all is because there is a record of the reply, and this reply from Quezon's office was subsequently copied out in carvings on boards made of malave and displayed in the village of Biabas. So here are the boards, they're still there, very hard to read now, but I've traced them for you so you can read it here. So the reply is formal, it's very bureaucratic, very dispassionate. You can see that President Quezon said, thanks for your invitation, we'll think about it. In other words, it's a face-saving no. Let's look at the date of the reply, right up there at the top, November the 11th, 1937. On the very day after this reply was sent, November the 12th, the Institute of National Language, staffed no doubt by graduates of UP Linguistics, formally recommended to the president that Tagalog should be chosen as the basis of a revised national tongue. So it's safe to say that Mariana de Tahon's little language, Boholano dialect, was not a candidate. Let's have another look at these boards, because in Biabas, the reply was ultimately translated from English into Visayan. There it is in Visayan. And into Mariana de Tahon's language and writing system. Here it is there. And here's a transliteration in the Roman alphabet, so you can have a look. Okay, so that's that basically, but easy to read. I'm going to give you a moment to read it on your screen and reflect on it. And in fact, I'll show you the original and the translation side by side. So just have a read through, and compare. Actually, no, sorry, I've got no, that's right. No, read that one. I'll show you something else later. So you're all linguists, so you'll notice immediately that there are lots of unusual and surprising things going on here, but I can tell you straight away that of all the several varieties of Visayan spoken today on Bohol, none can be said to show even the remotest relationship to this language on the right. Um, so looking at words like prok and krup, for example, they display consonant sequences that are rare in languages of the Philippines, while others such as con and nistro and berario in the green there are strongly reminiscent of Spanish. We can also see that the English word office, up there in the top left, has been translated as hoop rather than an expected loan such as oficina or office. But it's even more surprising that the long established place name Manila is rendered as Mande, if you look at the top right there. So then when you put it alongside the Visayan, there appears to be a virtual word for word relationship between the two texts. Same number of words. Okay, this is the language that Mariana de Tahon wanted to report to the president in 1937. At the time, de Tahon called it Visayan Declarado, or declared Visayan, if you like. Today it is called Eskaya or Eskayan, as I've decided to sort of anglicize it and put it in English. It's spoken in limited domains by about 550 people in 5 villages, including Biabas and some surrounding villages. I became very interested in investigating the history of Eskayan when I was first invited by the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines to evaluate it in 2005. And very quickly, I understood that this was no ordinary language. Just as importantly, I realized this was no ordinary history either. For at least 3 months, I couldn't travel to the Eskaya villages, so I spent that time looking at archives and records in Bohol, Cebu, and Manila. And this is when I learned that the way that Eskayan came into public awareness was very dramatic, and it didn't happen in 1937 with that exchange of letters. That made no impact in the public sphere. It really happened much later in 1980, after de Tahon and Quezon had long passed away. So we're now 1980, we're in the Marcos era, and this is when a group of advisors from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food made a visit to the province of Bohol to introduce agricultural techniques under the umbrella of the Green Revolution policies. They got to the highlands of the southeast and they encountered what they perceived to be a lost tribe speaking an unrecognized language. But these people did not fit the stereotype of the illiterate highland natives they learned about in high school, because there was a well-constructed school in the center of the village where scribes were copying out these beautiful books written in a very unique script. This account spread, and it created a sudden interest on the part of the local press. So some of these journalists exoticized the group as the living ancestors of a surviving pre-colonial Philippine civilization. Their language was puzzled over, resulting in conflicting hypotheses. It was an ancient indigenous tongue. It was the result of a distant migration from long ago. It was a recent innovation. Eskaya voices were mostly erased from the discussion. Amateur scholars were attracted to the community and developed various theories. For example, that the Eskaya were a lost tribe of Israel, or that they were descended from Etruscans. Some locals became fascinated by the real mystery of where the people had come from. Eskaya people themselves enjoyed a good mystery and shared cryptic prophecies and riddles. Even the title of one of the official Eskaya books takes the form of a classical riddle. So for those who are unfamiliar with this tradition, Filipino riddles are a bit of a dying art, but the way it works is you describe something in the natural world in terms of something in the ordinary social world, or vice versa. It's an exercise in metaphor, and your interlocutor is supposed to guess the answer. So here's a typical kind of Visayan riddle or tigmo. Dili raina dili hari apan sa ulo may corona. Neither a queen nor a king, but on its head there is a crown. If anyone can think of an answer to this riddle, you can, if you like, put it in a comment. We can return to it. Now, the Eskayan riddle that really tickled some of these early amateur investigators went like this. Ang sakbut ni Marilyn kinadakan sa kalibutan kinagamyan sa yuta. The grass of Maryland, or the weed of Maryland, the biggest in the world, the smallest in the land. The answer is not known, at least the solution is not recorded anywhere. But one of these early visitors to the Eskaya villages made the claim that if you understand this, you understand life itself. And I thought, okay, that's a challenge. I thought maybe it's bamboo. You have these little shoots that you can eat, and then you have these big stalks that you can use to make a house. I asked one Eskaya teacher what she thought the answer was, and she pondered it for days, and she eventually said, I think it's Tao, man, humankind. And it's a lesson about humility and greatness, about potential, how we should be as human beings. Okay, so this is the early period of press interest. Things really changed with the visit of Margarita Lagata, a Manila-based journalist, a magazine journalist. She came to the village of Taytay in 1981. She took some interesting photos and wrote an investigative report on it. And what she did was to approach the riddle of the Eskayan language, not through guesswork or her own personal intuition, but by coming right to where some of you are now at UP Linguistics Department, where she got hold of Ernesto Constantino. And this was a good person to contact because exactly 1 decade earlier, Constantino had published a paper in which he commented that we still don't know what Philippine languages are out there that have or haven't been described. So the quantification of Philippine languages was incomplete and largely done by guesswork. But when Logata brought him examples of Eskayan 10 years later in 1981, he said, you know what, it could be an undocumented language, but it might be a completely artificial language. It might be a kind of disguised speech. That's what he said there. And this was the argument that Logata actually ended up making in her magazine article she published that year. She said, the Eskaya are a cult. They've made up their language and they've done it in order to attract government patronage. They don't have enough roads, they don't have enough schools. So they want some attention. By the time I reached the Eskaya community at the end of 2005, I wanted to revisit the question of where the language came from, not as a mystic, not as a journalist, but as a linguist and as an anthropologist. So I could test Ernie Constantino's supposition and those of others. And I started by asking 2 questions. What story does the language tell us? And what does this story mean? It was very much a case of trying to ignore all the speculation and sensationalism and begin from the inside, moving out, from the language and the people and outwards to their context. And nobody had really done this. Nobody had asked Eskaya people for their take, nor had they looked in any great detail at the language. From the very first day of my fieldwork, I found out a few crucial things. Eskayan is not spoken as a native language. It's used for prayers, speech making, songs, and traditional schooling. So those are some images of where it is used. The second thing I learned is that it shared the same. Oh yeah. So and no one claims that they are native speakers of Eskayan, and no one claims that they're parents or grandparents. They're quite honest about this. It's something that you learn. Okay. So the second thing that I learned is that it shared the same word order as Boholano-Visayan, the language of Bohol. I'm not saying Cebuano so much in this talk because Boholano people object quite rightly to using Cebuano as the catch-all term for Visayan. So I'm going to now show you a short speech from Gemina Palma, Eskaya woman, in 2010, so you can finally hear the language. This is typically where we'll get technical problems. This video is also quite soft, so if you want to turn up your computer's volume to hear it a little bit better, I've already turned it up as best I can, but you can also just focus on the subtitles if you like. So here it is. Okay. Okay. Oops. So I hope, good. So I hope you could hear some of that. Over time, I learned much more. I learned that the grammars of Boholano-Visayan and Eskayan were not exactly identical. This was a bit of an illusion. There is a many one-to-one relationship in the verbal affixing. So the 24 Visayan verbal affixes and their allomorphs are handled by just 5 Eskayan counterparts. In this slide, everything in bold is Eskayan, and in italic, it's Visayan. It's hard to interpret, except just to focus on the fact that the bolded affixes are doing a lot of work. Eskayan Mui, for example, covers Visayan Nag, Mag, Maka, Ma, I, Gi, and so on. So it's so vague that it signals verbiness, if you like, more than anything else. What does the lexicon look like? What's the vocabulary look like? There's definitely an influence from uh, Visayan in the Eskayan lexicon, but there is also a lexical influence from Spanish, then English, then regional Visayan dialects like Hiligaynon, in that order of relevance. For most words, however, I could not find cognates from other languages at all. But regardless, the syllable structure, or phonotactics, if you prefer, um, across the lexicon is very Spanish. So classically, Eskayan words often sound like Spanish words without being cognate. Here's some examples. Okay, come back to those. Almurada, Biru Rayo, Gurusia, Crisiun. These are not Spanish words, but they sound really Spanish. What about the writing system? Okay, well, it's not baybayin, if that was your burning question. I'll try to put it as briefly as possible. It's an alpha syllabary, meaning that it has both alphabetic and syllabic characteristics. It's very irregular. There's a lot of redundancy, and there is also an influence from the Roman alphabet, which you can see just by looking at it here. So you can see on this page what looks like a copperplate letter A, and you can see that A is the the vowel nucleus of those syllables. There are around 1,000 signs in order to cope with this very complicated syllable structure of Eskayan that we've seen with lots of consonant clusters. But even so, more than half of these are not actually needed. They're recorded in reference works like the one you're looking at, but they're never actually used in written practice. And all this is very curious. And so I was also asking Eskayan people about their own origin stories for the language. Forget what the journalists were saying. And this is where I got drawn into the amazingly rich and complex corpus of Eskaya written literature and Eskaya oral literature. So Eskaya people have a whole bunch of texts that they reproduce in writing by copying out notebooks into new notebooks, and a parallel series of oral narratives that are never written down. And the story of the language comes up in both. This is my own attempt to amalgamate all of the language origin stories, and now I'm reading this from my book. Before the arrival of the Spanish, say Eskaya narrators, a chieftain by the name of Danko, with his 11 sons and 1 daughter, sailed from West Sumatra to Bohol and intermarried with the locals. The migrants maintained a distinct culture under the leadership of a man named Pinay, who is described as the first Inmoncictor, or Pope, in the Philippines. There's Pinay. The words underneath that image is Pinay Inmoncictor. Pinay was divinely instructed by a being known as Suno, or the Santo Niño, to create the Eskayan language and to base its form on a human body. This is why Eskayan letters resemble a body in various poses or individual body parts and internal organs. Pinay taught this language to the people, and the language they spoke beforehand is unknown. His Eskayan language, which was then called Visayan Declarado, or declared Visayan, was used throughout the island. Hang on a minute. Okay, well-known figures of Boholano history, such as Sikatuna and the rebel fighter Francisco de Gojoy, are claimed as ancestral speakers of Eskayan. Use of the language continued until the Spanish established a sustained presence in Bohol. Intent on destroying the indigenous culture, the Spanish suppressed Eskayan by systematically burning all the native records. In the meantime, Cebuano was introduced into Bohol from Cebu's printing presses and took root. Fortunately, records of Eskayan were hidden in a cave until they were discovered by the rebel soldier Mariana de Tahon. There he is. In another version, it was Mariana de Tahon who received direct linguistic inspiration from the ancestral past, and he wrote down the language on wooden tablets, which were then stored away for protection in a cave by his followers. In any event, de Tahon is credited with the feat of reanimating the Eskayan of Pinay and of retransmitting it to his followers. So that's the end of my quote from the book. So I'll say very briefly that this account given by Eskaya people is broadly consistent with the linguistic evidence as I analysed it. It looks very much as if Eskayan was created all at once within a single generation through a relexification of Boholano-Visayan. In other words, the ancestral creator, whoever he or she was, took Visayan as a grammatical template and repopulated it with new words. Most of these words are completely unique, but a small proportion are from Visayan and from colonial languages, as we've seen. The place where my analysis conflicts with the literary records and oral histories is mostly in the timing. So Eskayan people assign various folkloric dates to the creation of Eskayan and the life of Pinay, and all of them are pre-Hispanic. Whereas my analysis places the creation in the post-Hispanic period to account for the Spanish and English influence. Of course, all Philippine languages are influenced by Spanish and English in their lexicons, but they usually don't borrow core terms for things like body parts, which we do get in Eskayan. For example, lup from the English word lip, and piel from the Spanish word piel, meaning skin. There's also a very large number of non-borrowed terms for introduced species and technologies. So words for steamer or aeroplane or photograph are not inspired by Spanish. Here's just a small taste of this phenomenon. Okay, so you can have a quick look at that, but that's sort of page one of many pages, just the first in alphabetical order. These words at the very least must have been innovated. So why not all of the words, as the oral history suggests? What I try to reconstruct in my book is the process by which Eskayan was quote unquote retrieved from a yearned for pre-Hispanic world. This recuperation, I argue, was primed by the events of the Philippine-American War in Bohol, which, among other things, led to massive population displacements, including a movement of refugees from the town of Luon in the west all the way inland to Biabas. So this is my reconstruction from genealogies, where people in Biabas came from at that time. This refugee community became radicalized by Mariana de Tahon, who we've seen already, a multilingual prophet and spiritual leader who continued to oppose the US administration and never really accepted the terms of surrender. Probably in the 1920s, the Eskayan writing system was first revealed to him through the intercession of the ancestor Pinay, followed by the Eskayan language, and this process of revelation continued until the mid to late 1930s. And de Tahon then dictated a corpus of texts in the language. Just to complicate it a little bit more, my analysis suggests that it wasn't just de Tahon, but a lot of people were involved in this process, and particularly women were involved in this process of receiving the language. So that's my condensed analysis of how and why this language came into being. The bigger story is strung out over 10 chapters in my book, but Eskayan is valued by its speakers as the authentic primordial language, older than Spanish and English, older even than Visayan. It has a prior claim, but it's also the youngest language. Those Boholanos who followed de Tahon had to learn it for the first time, and all of the present day speakers had to learn it as a second language. Words were actively created for it. New words get innovated for it even today. It's a tiny language, only a few hundred speakers, but there is a prophecy about Eskayan that one day it will be spoken by everyone in the world. It will be the last language on earth. And at that time, Biabas itself is predicted to be the center of world affairs. Let's go back to the Visayan riddle that we saw before. Dili Reina Dili Hari, that one. The answer, of course, is bayabas, guava. You can see the crown there, which is also where the Eskayan village of Bayabas derives its name. The legend is that a guava tree grew there once. What about the answer to the Eskayan riddle? Where is it? What is the Sagbut ni Marilin? I think it's okay for us all to have our own answer to this. My own notion, which only came to me quite recently, is that it is the Eskayan language itself. That's my solution. Just as the Filipino national language was created with the stroke of a pen, with authentic native words innovated to fill the gaps like bansa and pangulo, Eskayan was also declared into being. It is the most ancient and most recent, the tiniest and yet most ambitious, the biggest in the world, the smallest in the land. And if you understand that, you understand life itself. Lami Samyal, that's thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelly, for that very interesting and insightful presentation. It's more of a demystification of Eskaya. It's actually very interesting to me because I speak a variety which is close to Boholano, where Eskaya
Okay.
is spoken. Okay, so to give her commentary on today's lecture, we welcome Cristina Gallego, Assistant Professor and current Chairperson of the UP Department of Linguistics. Her PhD project focused on language contacts between Ivatan and Ilocano on the island of Babuyan Claro in Cagayan. She is currently working on further documentation of Ivatan, funded by Endangered Languages Documentation Program. And she has a forthcoming book review on Dr. Kelly's book, which will be published in the journal Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints in December. Okay, hello, Tina.
Hi everyone. I'm currently here in my hometown, so apologies for my background. So I'd like to begin my commentary by saying that it's easy to oversimplify understandings of Eskaya because of its origins as a constructed language of sorts. That is, as we have heard, accounts about Eskaya since its discovery in the 1980s range from reductive, it's simply a hoax, to exotic, it's a lost language of an ancient pre colonial civilization. But Piers Kelly, in this seminar and in his book, has demonstrated that the story of Eskaya presents a complex interweaving of history and language. As Pierce situates the creation of the Eskaya language and script within the socio-historical context of the community, his research thus touches on various topics in the field of linguistics, namely the role of history in the development of language, language ideologies shaping people's choices and perceptions about their languages, the pathways of language contact and change, and language endangerment and how this is tied to the issue of social justice. And because I have a limited time for today, I will only talk about some aspects which resonated the most with me and perhaps our audience today. The story of the Eskaya people that Pierce presents is but one of the many narratives coming out of the colonial history of the Philippines. While on the surface, the directions of each story of each communities appear to be divergent, they all reflect different ways Filipinos have adapted to massive socio-political changes to which they were subjected. Now, in terms of language genesis, contact, and change, the agentivity of the individual in manipulating their language is magnified in the case of Eskaya, with it being the product of the creative mind of Pinay and or Mariano de Tahon. As we have seen in the presentation, Eskaya involves a split between a mostly innovated lexicon, which is inspired by local and colonial languages, namely Spanish and English, and a Visayan grammar. So this makeup of Eskaya precisely reflects the agentivity of Mariano de Tahon with Visayan as his linguistically dominant language, thus becoming the basis of Eskayan grammar, and his other non-dominant languages becoming the model of Eskayan lexicon. Now, in terms of language change in Eskaya, this proceeds through the agentivity of its current users, all of whom are linguistically non dominant in the language, as they only learn and use it in school and other formal settings. So, what drives further language change is the norm against altering Eskayan text based on the belief that the written form is a sacred embodiment of the language. Thus, Eskayan literature and the language script itself are subjected to further diversification, as errors are typically left uncorrected. So, Eskaya therefore presents an interesting case study as the context of its emergence and development is relatively uncommon compared to other languages. Now, finally, the story of Eskaya resonates with issues on language endangerment, social justice, and social change. While the current viability of Eskaya is seen in how the language is being transmitted to the younger generations through formal instruction, the number of people learning it is declining, which may eventually lead to its endangerment. And this problem is deeply connected with the issue of social justice. Given the relative isolation of the Eskayan villages, the Eskaya people experience less privileges and institutional support compared to the lowlanders. And despite the Eskaya language being highly valued by its users, it is only with long lasting social change that the viability of the language in the future can be assured. I think that's for my part. And I think we can talk about some of these aspects at the Q&A. Thanks, Piers, for a very insightful talk.
Thank you for that great summary and review. That helped me understand my book.
Thank you as well, Tina, for your commentary on that. Okay. At this point, we'll open the floor for question and answers. Okay. For questions, rather. I have our speaker answer. Okay. Wait. Um, are you familiar also with the Sadai? Is there like
Yeah,
a
so there's a
correlation as to the discovery of these things?
yes, that's the Tassadai affair occurred, I think, in 1979. Oh, at some time. Don't quote me. But it was quite. It was in the same period. It was the same kind of Marcos period as well. So this Tassadai affair was still kicking along in the 1980s, and I write about the Tassadai affair in the last chapter of the book as well. For those who don't know about the Tassadai affair, this is also a very, very complicated situation where an uncontacted group of people were quote unquote discovered in the middle of the jungles of Mindanao. And they were heralded as a lost tribe, but there was lots of government meddling, and there was no anthropological work. And in the end, there were all these accusations that the tribe, the Tassadai people, were a hoax, and they were seen wearing, grass skirts and living in harmony with nature and foraging and so on. But subsequent revisiting of this affair suggests that actually the group was very much an uncontacted group, that they were not a Stone Age tribe as they had been framed in the media, but they were who they were. And the genealogies of these people and the languages confirm this. But at the time, there was when the Eskaya came to public attention, the tide had turned against this sort of Eden type framing of the Tassadai community. And so people were already very skeptical, automatically skeptical of the Eskaya people outside of Bohol. So all those newspaper articles I showed you before, they're mostly within Bohol or within the Visayas. So it took someone coming from Manila to come in and say, no, this is a cult. Yes, and as we say, the truth is always a little bit more complex than either one of those accounts. Either, as Christina mentioned before, both of these representations are very reductive.
Okay, thank you for that. Um, A question from one of our viewers. Does the data suggest that the number of Eskayan speakers have declined over the years, or is the number always around 500?
I wish I knew, and I didn't do very good sophisticated surveys of speakers. So my number in there, 550, is based on me going to each settlement and asking for a consensus on speaker numbers. So that was probably around 2010 was when I did that. It's not extremely scientific, but in any case, there's no survey of speaker numbers before then or after then. So it's hard to say it's the declining or increasing, but it's also true that the numbers of people attending classes is declining, but it does go in peaks and troughs. So in the 1980s, when there was all that interest, there were 150 people in the classes, and now you'd be lucky to have about 30. But then every so often it becomes really popular again, and even in the time that I spent there between, 2005 and 2011 mostly, I saw big jumps in interest in learning Eskayan. So the trend is downwards, but there is potential for hope. And every time a chieftain dies, there's a new kind of regime, really. So there's new things. So now there's English is being introduced as part of Eskayan language learning. So people are, for fun, writing English words using the Eskaya script. And that was completely forbidden under previous chieftains who rejected English, who hated English. But there's a bit more openness now.
So I guess this also plays into the generational transmission. Is it being taught at homes, or is it really just in a formal setting?
It's the teaching happens in a formal setting. Historically, it happened in homes. In Mariana de Tahon's day, it first happened in homes. Then they built a school. There is also now teaching in a local DepEd school in Tai Tai for the first half an hour of the day. So that's using DepEd style methods. And I went to some of those classes. They're really well taught. Eskaya teachers are very good teachers. They use traditional techniques, the old call and response, recite everything at the same time, but they also use really, really creative ways to teach the language. And I, at the beginning, decided I'm not going to be involved. I'm an outsider. This is not my place. And I've been primed by all these stories about how they're a secret society and so on, and they might be hostile. It's not true. In the end, I just joined the classes, and it's really fun. It is really fun to sit down in these classes and to learn. It is very hard, but also very stimulating. So it's like doing a crossword puzzle or something. You have to sort of figure out the answer, and you're learning the writing system at the same time. But a lot of the domain of use of Eskayan, which I didn't really go into in this talk, is in writing. So while these are the spoken domains I talked about, speech making, singing, and prayers, and teaching, they're written domains. That happens in the school, but that also happens privately. People copying out these books and recopying them and retransmitting them. And it is understood, it is valued by the speakers as a written language. So you can write an English word in the script, and they'll say, no, that's now Eskayan. We just turned it into Eskayan just by writing it using our script. So the script is very, very central to the value of the language and how it's used.
Oh, there's actually a question here about that. Can you discuss the ideology behind Eskaya's script, or how sacred the people view the written form over the oral form?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and I never really fully understood, because I would get the Eskaya would give me the kind of doctrine. They would say, this is what we believe about our script, and then I would see, so we never cross out anything that's written in Eskayan, even if it's wrong. And I saw that, and it was very annoying too, because even when they wrote in the Roman script, they wouldn't do that. So I had these genealogy forms where they'd get the name wrong. My great-grandfather was so-and-so. Whoops, that's not his name. They'd write another name. Oh, what's that? Not his name. Another name. They wouldn't cross it out. So I had to guess which was the right name, or then ask. So there's no crossing out. But then in other cases, I saw people happily crossing out Eskaya script. They didn't care. But it is this idea, there's very much an ideology that the script is an embodiment of truth. One of these was, there's a case, so there is some special women's rituals that I didn't ask about. I wasn't wanting to ask about too, because I knew that they were private. But there was one of the songs that the women sang called Bathala, a beautiful song, and I recorded it many, many times. And eventually I said, can I please write out the words to this song? I want to do a proper transcription. They said, oh, no, no. You cannot write it. You can hear it. You can even sing it yourself. Do not write it. So that was the point where once it was in writing, that was the sacred form. You don't mess with it. And if it's a restricted prayer, then you don't share it in writing. But it's fine if you want to hear it. That's fine. There is a previous researcher, Christina, also called Christina Martinez. She recorded this Eskaya saying that language without writing is like air in the mouth, hangin sa baba, air in the mouth. So it's intangible. It's insubstantial unless you write it down.
Another question will, can you talk a bit more about Mariana de Tahon, who has reintroduced Eskayan, and how he managed to spread this to an entire community of users?
Okay, so he's for me a troubling figure. He's not always. He's very much respected within the Eskaya community. He passed away in, I think, 1949. I think in 1949. But he was I'll give you the short version, because there's a lot to say about Mariana de Tahon. The short version is that he was from a fishing village in Lu'un, a very poor family. But he was adopted he was basically taken under the wing of a Spanish priest who made him an altar boy and who taught him Spanish, who gave him literacy, who he learnt Latin, and he may also have participated in writing or contributing to a Visayan grammar. This priest was called Father Felix Guillen, and you can find his grammar still today. So this was in the late 19th century. So he was poor, but then astonishingly well educated. And then when the Philippine-American War happened, everyone remembers that Bohol was sort of a separate part of the Philippine-American War. They were separated from the rest of Katipunan were not in Bohol. It was a separate kind of group, and they maintained a republic there while the Katipunan were busy surrendering elsewhere. So there was a period of time when Bohol was at least feeling itself to be completely independent, not just from Spain, also from the Philippines. And so people refer to that period as the Republic of Bohol. And Mariana de Tahon came of age at this time. And he was a very, very fanatical soldier fighting against the Americans when the Americans landed there in 1901. And he also fought against his own comrades. He got disciplined by his own comrades. And he was court-martialed but absolved. So he was a kind of a permanent rebel, if you like. And then he invited Gregorio Aglipay to Bohol and said, I'm going to establish the Philippine Independent Church in Bohol. And he established various parishes under the banner of the Philippine Independent Church, but from the very earliest days. So even when Aglipayanism was very young, he brought that to Southeast Bohol. And what else did he do? Yeah, and he continued actions against the Americans. There were several attacks against settlements, administration, but he largely settled down. And then he became a religious figure. So he took his anti-colonialism, he fused it with his spirituality, which was already there in the Philippine Independent Church, this kind of rebel church, this very patriotic rebel church. But then he created his own version of the church, if you like. So under the doctrine of Aglapayanism, he created his own spirituality. He created his own set of principles and laws, his own flag, and so on. And he had numerous wives. Eskaya people would say, oh, he had 100 wives. He had 50 wives. Went through all their family trees, and I think I counted about 16, at least, of women with whom he had children. And then he fought against the Japanese. But again, he was a pain to his comrades. So the other rebel fighters in Bohol were really, really annoyed with him because he would take the weapons and not share them. And he would, and then his own men were very undisciplined, and they would start like extracting food from villages instead of protecting people from the Japanese. This was their claim anyway, but he was just phenomenally independent. No one would tell him what to do. So that's a little bit about Mariana de Tahon. Some of this is from oral history, some of it's from American reports. Yeah.
Kind of rather headstrong stubborn
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait, let me see. Another question is about what do you think is the future of the Eskaya language or the script?
Yeah, I don't know. I go from between being pessimistic and optimistic. I think it's interesting coming back to Australia and then watching the little promo of the Katig Collective that we saw at the beginning of this presentation, that, you know, the number of the 175 Philippine languages and this many endangered and so on. And I was looking at that going, that's sad, but that's great compared to Australia. You know, like our Indigenous languages are really, really shocking. And in terms of being under a lot of stress. And even when I reported to my supervisor in Canberra and I said, oh, you know, there's 550 speakers of Eskayan, there's probably 16 people who speak it really, really well. And he goes, that's fantastic. The language I'm working on, the number of speakers could fit in the backseat of a taxi. So I just thought, okay, well, that's not bad. That's pretty good. That's quite a good number of speakers. There's enthusiasm for it. There's stable domains of use, but also it's volatile in the sense that it's very much at the mercy of the political situation in Southeast Bohol, with contests over resources, contests over boundaries, contests over Eskaya rights to make decisions about water and so on. And there's also, you know, it's historically, there's a lot of, there's insurgent activity there, but there are also other, if you like, cults that are more cult-like, that are armed and dangerous and destabilizing in that whole area. So it has been, if you look at the long picture, it's a history of great ups and downs. But on the other hand, it is a long picture. So the community has been there since 1902, and they've been speaking the language for as long as there has been a Department of Linguistics at UP. You know, so it's been there since the 1920s. So that is my evasive answer. The conclusion being, I don't know.
Rather complicated geopolitics.
Yeah.
So in relation to it, of course, they are in Bohol, and do the Eskayan speakers usually speak Boholano or Cebuano as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, cool. That comment pops up. That's cool. Yeah, they do. In fact, they absolutely do. And they make no pretense otherwise. This is the language that is spoken. We speak Boholano-Visayan. Very similar to Cebuano, but there are some phonological differences, especially in the southeast. That's another interesting question. So in Eskayan language borrows from, to a certain extent, from the accent of Eastern Boholano-Visayan with this you know, this jamo jud thing that Boholanos love, and sounds amazing. Well, you listen to Eskayan, you'll hear a lot of the j, even in that speech that I played before, jarokon, 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 you know, this kind of j sound. But yes, sorry, to actually go to the question, everyone there speaks Boholano-Visayan in day-to-day. Occasionally it's used spontaneously, very occasionally. But otherwise it's used in these speech making, these formal settings where you're going to expect to hear it, or when you're going to say a prayer or something. I probably heard it more spontaneously than others because I'm very obviously an outsider. So sometimes people spoke Eskayan in order to both include me and exclude me. So I would turn up on my little motorbike and I would hear, people yelling out, and they go, Milyamun, Milyamun, which means let's eat, or Ujirin, and they'd pull out the tanduai, let's drink, which, just for fun. And also in some of the village meetings, their village meetings were taking place in Boholano-Visayan. But when people were a bit embarrassed about talking about me in those meetings, they would switch to Eskayan, which was not the best choice because my Eskayan was probably better than my Boholano-Visayan. So I don't ask me to speak Visayan, I'm awful. So yes, it's absolutely, Boholano-Visayan is the language used day to day, except for occasionally spontaneously and in these other domains.
So there's really a big influence of Boholano on the language, phonology and phonology
The
level.
phonology, yeah. There's
And
probably
phonology
less
level.
of an influence than you would expect, though. And
Oh,
that's the point I make in the book, is that you would think the influence is there in the morphosyntax, in the grammar. And it's there to a certain extent in the lexicon. But I would have predicted a greater influence. But even when you looked at the beginning of the presentation, when I showed those signboards that are carved, you look at it, the Visayan and the Eskayan side by side, it's virtually impossible to see much that's similar between the two languages. It's really quite, on the face of it, quite starkly different.
Question from Patricia Asuncion. I read from one of your papers that the characters of the Eskaya script resemble human body parts and pulses. Does this concept make it easier for L2 users to learn the writing system?
Oh God, these questions are so good. I love getting good questions. Yeah, I think so, and it does enter into the pedagogy. So when you see someone teaching Eskayan, especially to children, so they always have a children's class and an adults class, there's a lot of standing up and demonstrating and moving the body, and but there are some things you can't. There's limits to that. So I had a feeling that at one point that in fact that might inform some of the origins of the script. If you look at some old images of the early Thomasite teachers in the Philippines, those Americans who came to teach English in these American schools at the beginning of the 20th century, they've got these charts a bit like, the one behind me, but they've got A is for apple, B is, and there's a picture. H is for hat, and there's a picture, and classically S is for snake, and you can see the S shape of the snake, that sort of thing. And I suspect that this might have been even itself, a desire to teach was part of what made it made bodies a really good template for teaching. There's even Eskaya stories along those lines that say, Spanish letters are kind of useless because they're based on things like a pair of letter X is a pair of scissors, and I is a candle stand, but Eskayan is much more natural because all of it comes from the human body. The problem is that a lot of these body parts are inside the body. So how you demonstrate, esophagus or intestines or whatever. And also there's 1,000 characters. So you can't, unless you're an anatomist, you really can't get that many body parts that are recognizable. But the first characters that kids learn is a set of 46, and they're all said to be inspired by body parts. There's even a really cool story. It's one of the only stories that never gets translated from Eskayan into Visayan, and it's a story about where all the letters come from, and all their value, all their virtues and vices. So the letter F is a thief. Be careful around the letter F. But the letter M is an intellectual. And the letter G is really smart because it looks like a brain. All this stuff.
A symbolism attached to it as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Mhm. Uh, This is actually from Tina. To add to what you have said about language vitality, the Eskaya people have filed for their certificate of ancestral domain claim, and this highlights how they have been fighting for their place from the very beginning. Can you share an update about their claim?
I can't because I don't know. And every time I go back to Bohol, I wonder if there's an update. But I'm also in shaky legal territory if I make any sort of speculation about how this goes, and I don't want to interfere with that process. But it is the case that the Eskaya got a certificate of a DENR certificate for claim as opposed to title, which gives them certain rights already. But the issue that is very, very thorny, which goes for every group in the Philippines, is the difficulty of defining Indigenous. So Indigenous is very easy to define here in Australia. You know, you're either a settler or you're Indigenous. It's pretty clear. But in the Philippines, who is Indigenous? Everyone or no one. If you wanted to go by the Australian kind of rules, you'd go, well, the Arti are Indigenous, but nobody else, you know. So the term Indigenous has a different meaning in the Philippines, in Filipino English, which is one that is more about maintaining cultural traditions for a long period of time, for as long as anyone can remember. So that means that even certain religious groups, including Muslim groups in Mindanao, can come under the banner of Indigenous. But if you use that term in a different context, in a different country, in a different kind of scholarly context as well, then you'll get into dispute. So it's up to the lawyers to define that term. But I don't know if you guys remember way back when Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was trying to use the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act to as a way to get peace negotiations kick-started from a new angle in Mindanao. It didn't work. I think the High Court threw it out. But it points to this idea that it's much more ambiguous, this idea of indigeneity in the Philippines, and that ambiguity is also in the law. So we'll leave it to the lawyers. I'm always worried that the Eskaya will hate me for presenting this case, that I've tried to be as honest as possible while representing their view, and that I don't want it ever to undermine their interests. But so far, actually, it seems to everyone still likes me, and it doesn't. Every time I go back and I've got a new report or a new paper, they're like, great, put it on the pile. We'll give this to the lawyers. It's going to be great. It's like, really? Okay, sure. You know, so again, it's this attitude to the written word. Written word is fantastic. Doesn't matter what it says, it's written. So yeah, that's my meandering and evasive answer again.
Or rather, language plays really a factor into their claim, I think.
Yeah.
One last question is, how different is Eskaya from other known constructed languages?
Oh, okay. This is a very open question, and maybe someone else might be able to answer this. I did a talk recently at a conlangs conference, a conlanging, like constructed language conference, that was in Belgium. And in my paper, I tried to look at what the commonalities are between these constructed languages. But rather than look at things like Esperanto and, you know, Volapük and, you know, Game of Thrones type languages like Dothraki and what's the Star Trek one, Klingon. So there's that. These have these world building kind of functions, which Eskaya does too. You've got a literature and you've got characters using this in dialogue in the literature. So some characters will be speaking in Eskayan and others in Visayan in order to, you know, to build their characters. There's that side of it. But I would rather compare it to other constructed languages that are from small communities, isolated communities in Southeast Asia. So if you look at all through island Southeast Asia, Indonesia, into Papua New Guinea, you can see other type Eskaya type situations where, even in the north of Australia, where small Indigenous groups have created a new language and they use it in specific ways. One of the things that they do seem to all have in common, and also with Eskaya, is this the languages are always used as a way of creating a bounded social space for particular kinds of activities. So in New Guinea, in parts of New Guinea, you get this language called Kalam Pandanus language, which you use for when you're collecting pandanus nuts, and you'll get better luck if you just use this language, and the spirits won't come and take your pandanus nuts. Or when you're just hunting cassowary, you use this particular language. Or if you use this language to avoid storms or whatever. So it's carving off this space. Same in Australia, you have these special secretive languages that are used historically, at least, for initiated boys. On Mornington Island, but also avoidance languages used quite a large area of Australia. So when you're talking to your mother-in-law or she's within earshot, you have to use this other kind of language. So I think that's where you see these points of commonality. These are all languages that are doing a job, and they're doing social work. They're performing social actions just simply by being spoken.
Creating social spaces as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so final question, because I said the one earlier is final. Okay, so this is the last one. Okay, have they translated the Bible into Eskaya?
Oh, you know what? I have no idea. I have no idea. I don't think so. I don't think so. I found they let me try and think. I do remember some bits of scripture. A catechism translated into Eskayan. That's one of the earliest translations. A catechism from Father Astete, but not the Bible. I've never seen the Bible. It wouldn't be super difficult for Eskaya people to do it because they're very much in the business of doing this kind of hermeneutic work, this very literary writing-based work. So who knows? Who knows one day?
Yeah, we'll just wait for it to be available. Okay, so thank you so much.
No worries.
Piers. Yeah, and this is such a lively discussion as well. So
thank you.
At this point, we're gonna present to you our certificate of appreciation.
Aww, okay, look at that.
So this certificate of appreciation is hereby given to Piers Kelly for delivering a lecture titled The Eskayan Language of Bohol, the youngest and most ancient in the Philippines, as part of the Linguistics Special Lecture Series organized by the UP Department of Linguistics and the Katig Collective. So given this 27th of October 2022 and signed by our chairperson, Maria Cristina Eskaya. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I'm very touched. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Before we end, some announcements as well for some of the next centennial events of the department. So we will be holding our third and fourth installments of the LSLS on November 4, 10 a.m., this time with speakers both from the Indian Institute of Technology, BHU, Varanasi. Associate Professor Sanjukta Ghosh for a lecture on the cross-cultural study of verbal and visual metaphors in advertisements, and Associate Professor Anil Thakur will lecture on Indian linguistic diversity. On November 15 as well, there will be another installment of Lexicon Unpacked, which will examine the intricacies of the word sakit, to be presented by Mr. Michael Manahan and Mary Diane Hamindang. For more details and for other events, you may check and follow the social media accounts of the UP Department of Linguistics. So for those who tuned in, kindly accomplish the evaluation form. Okay, as shown in the screen. Is it shown already? Okay, so and as posted in the comments section, you will receive your certificate of participation after answering the evaluation form. And this will be available until today. Okay. So thank you once again, Dr. Kelly, Assistant Professor Gallego, and everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you all again in the future events of the UP Department of Linguistics. Okay, thank you.